And Congressman Kevin McCarthy's forced vacancy from the speakership is not only creating chaos in Congress, but also for the White House. President Biden has signaled that he hopes the House will move expeditiously to choose a permanent speaker, as a number of policies could remain in limbo, including the United States' continued support for Ukraine. Here to elaborate more on the administration's reaction to Republican rabble-rousers in the House is Brett Samuels, The Hill's White House correspondent. Brett, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Hey, so just to start off, I want to ask, what has been the reaction from the White House, from President Biden on this ouster of Kevin McCarthy? Of course, President Biden and McCarthy had worked in the past, particularly with that debt limit deal. So what's the White House and the president saying now?
Yeah, well, like you said, I think that the president and the speaker, or the former speaker now, they certainly had a working relationship, even if it wasn't a cozy relationship. We've seen the White House, they sort of wanted to keep their hands out of any kind of discussion about whether Democrats should either save McCarthy or back this motion to vacate. And similarly, we're seeing them kind of staying on the sidelines as the House tries to work through who should be the next speaker after Kevin McCarthy. They don't want to kind of wade into that. All they've said so far is that they are willing to work with whoever the next speaker is. And we heard President Biden just a little bit ago from the White House say, that the dysfunction in the House does concern him. So I think that the White House is sort of maybe not nervously, but sort of, they're certainly carefully watching what is going to play out in the House in the coming days and weeks.
And look, when we talk about the relationship between President Biden and Speaker McCarthy, they did strike that debt limit deal back over the summer. Speaker McCarthy did put that clean continuing resolution on the floor to avert a government shutdown. So they did have some success in their relationship. But very notably, Kevin McCarthy essentially had his committee chairs mark up appropriations bills at levels lower than the caps that were set in that debt limit deal, which was seen by a number of Democrats on Capitol Hill as walking away from that deal, reneging on the agreement. Is there any sense, do you have any sense that the White House is maybe happy to see McCarthy go, considering, a number of Democrats have said that he's untrustworthy, pointing to that debt limit deal that he walked away from just a couple days after it was signed into law?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think on the one hand, obviously, the White House does not like to see the House in sort of chaos and in dysfunction. They certainly don't like sort of the uncertainty that comes with it, with just basically 40 days at this point to fund the government beyond this continuing resolution that was passed. And they don't like sort of the uncertainty around Ukraine aid, which Al talked about. But on the other hand, the White House has been very adamant in the last couple of weeks as Congress seemed to sort of hurtle toward a shutdown. The White House has been very adamant that they made an agreement with Speaker McCarthy, with then Speaker McCarthy earlier this year, and that they were frustrated that he appeared to be reneging on that deal, going back on what they had agreed to. So certainly, while I think that the White House does not like seeing the House just in shambles, basically, there definitely was a sense of frustration that the two sides had reached an agreement and that this was on McCarthy, that he was sort of creating his own mess by going back on the deal that they had reached.
And then you mentioned the issue of Ukraine aid, so did Al, which I think is going to be a really central part of conversations for the rest of the year. There was some signaling that Kevin McCarthy was going to put aid for Ukraine on the floor this week. That was sort of what House Democratic leadership over the weekend had signaled. Of course, now Kevin McCarthy's out of a job, out of his leadership job. And a catalyst that sort of led to this ouster at the end of the day was Matt Gaetz had claimed there was a quote, secret side deal on Ukraine between Speaker McCarthy and President Biden. Speaker McCarthy rejected that notion, just saying that it was a technicality that had to do with the Ukraine aid that was included in the CR. So I wanted to ask you, A, what is the White House saying about this supposed secret side deal? I think it's significant because, again, Gaetz brought his motion to vacate hours after giving a speech about this deal. So, A, what is the White House saying about that? And then, B, you mentioned it right there. The White House must be concerned about being able to get Ukraine aid over the finish line in the coming months because, we don't know who the speaker is going to be. And clearly there's not an appetite, an overwhelming appetite in the Republican conference.
Definitely. To sort of take the first point that you mentioned, this idea of whether there was this side deal or some kind of negotiation happening between the White House or an agreement between the White House and Kevin McCarthy. President Biden, in the aftermath of this continuing resolution being passed over the weekend, gave remarks in which he sort of alluded to some kind of, agreement that he had with McCarthy, basically saying that he trusted McCarthy because they had made some kind of deal on Ukraine. But then the White House would not sort of specify or elaborate on whether there was some kind of concrete agreement. So essentially it was left sort of just hanging there. And I think that gave an opening to somebody like Matt Gaetz to essentially interpret it as some kind of side deal, even though it was never really clear that there was anything beyond just a hope from the White House that Kevin McCarthy would bring Ukraine aid up for a vote because there is this sort of bipartisan support for additional Ukraine aid. So certainly that is still a bit of a fuzzy area, but it's one that was definitely a catalyst, like you mentioned, for Kevin McCarthy's ultimate ouster. Looking ahead, as you said, I think Ukraine aid is going to be a big point of concern for the White House, for a lot of lawmakers on Capitol Hill. As Emily mentioned, some of these candidates who are being floated as the potential next Speaker of the House in the Republican side, not all of them are necessarily pro-Ukraine. Some of them have been rather outspoken. Jim Jordan, for example, in sort of resisting or opposing, just continuing to put up votes for additional Ukraine aid. But this is something that the White House has been very outspoken about. We heard President Biden just today say that he's going to give a speech in the coming days, basically laying out sort of the importance of continued U.S. support for Ukraine. The White House believes that this is something where there are lawmakers on both sides and both chambers of Congress that really support aid for Ukraine and sort of fighting off Russia during its invasion of Ukraine. So we'll see where it lands, but certainly this is an area where I think the White House, it's fair to say, is a little anxious to see how this all plays out, because depending on how the speaker race plays out, looking ahead, that could definitely further hinder their hopes to secure what they're looking for, which at this point is about $24 billion in military and humanitarian aid for Ukraine, on top of what they've already funded.
Yeah, and in addition to Ukraine, another key topic and issue and story when you talk about this intersection between Congress and the White House is, of course, the impeachment inquiry into President Biden that Speaker McCarthy unilaterally opened last month. He did that after saying he would hold a vote to open the inquiry, then went back on that word and ended up just launching it on his own accord. So I spoke to Congressman Garrett Graves earlier today, a Republican from Louisiana, a close McCarthy ally, and he was essentially saying that not having a speaker, which essentially basically shuts down business or most of business in the House, will have some sort of effect on the impeachment inquiry. So I'm curious, is the White House aware that this could sort of slow down House Republican efforts on impeachment? And are they planning any messaging, or have you seen any messaging yet on sort of the chaos in the House and this having no speaker and scrambling and to find a leader on the backdrop of, hey, they're also going forward with the impeachment inquiry that has been highly criticized by the White House?
Yeah, well, you mentioned it, but chaos is sort of like the buzzword, I think it's fair to say, for the White House when they're talking about House Republicans in particular. We've seen, especially over the past week, which is basically when this impeachment inquiry, the first hearing took place was last week. But over the past week or so, we've seen the White House really try to hammer home this idea of a split screen, quote unquote, this idea that on one side of Pennsylvania Avenue, you have House Republicans sowing what the White House believes is chaos with this impeachment inquiry, which the White House believes is baseless, with sort of the intra-party fighting over who should be in charge. And then on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House is happy to sort of project this idea of competence, that President Biden is continuing to work for the American people, that they're going to roll out policy wins around lowering prescription drug costs, marking the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we'll see in the coming days, again, as I mentioned, likely a speech from the president on continued support for Ukraine. We saw today he talked about student debt relief. So this is a contrast that the White House is happy to hammer home. And I think, the absence of a speaker and the fact that the sort of Republicans eating their own at this point just kind of feeds into that. And the White House is going to be happy to elevate that and continue to talk about that contrast.
All right. Brett Samuel, White House correspondent for The Hill. Thank you so much.
Thanks.